When scientists want to solve a problem, they use something called the scientific method. You've probably heard of it before. Really, it's just a set of rules, a set of steps that scientists follow to help organize their information, to help organize their experimentation, to help organize them making scientific discoveries, right? And we can actually do this with a lot of things that are very complicated and things that are very simple. And I'm going to show you a simple example of that today. But before I do, let's go through what those steps actually are. Step 1 is to ask a question. So find something that you're curious about. Find a question that no one has the answer to yet, or find a question that you just don't know the answer to yet, and ask it. So the question that I'm going to be asking in the experiment today is, will an egg float in water? Or will it sink? You know, how does an egg act in water? I'm going to ask more questions when we get into the experiment, but I'll save that for later. So will an egg float in water? That's my question. And then step 2 is to form a hypothesis. Now, what is a hypothesis? That sounds like a big word and is somewhat scary to people who don't know it. A hypothesis is pretty much just a guess. It's a guess as to what the answer to your question is. And you need to make sure that your hypothesis is not super broad. Make it specific, because we're going to have to test it in the next step. Step 3 is to create an experiment to test your hypothesis. So for instance, I'm asking, will an egg float in water? Now I'm going to make an experiment. And I'm going to put the egg in water. And then I'm going to be able to tell, after looking at what happens, which is step 4, observing the results of your experiment, I can draw a conclusion, which is step 5. So I'm going to make an experiment, do the experiment and observe what happens, and then make a conclusion about my hypothesis based off of what I observe. Those are the last 3 steps. Now, you may actually prove that your hypothesis was wrong. Say my hypothesis was that the egg will sink, and the egg actually floats. Then my hypothesis was wrong. But this happens all the time. Scientists across the world are constantly proving their hypotheses wrong, and that is an awesome thing. Because if we don't know what's wrong, then we're not going to be able to figure out what's right. And knowing what's wrong is a very valuable thing. And the scientific method helps us get to that. So now, before I continue rambling on, I'm going to show you an example of the scientific method. Alright, so what's this experiment that I'm talking about? So what we're going to need is a glass of water. I filled this about 3/4 of the way full, but you just need to make sure that it won't spill over. I would recommend having paper towels just in case that happens. I have got some salt here. I have a spoon, and I have an egg. Alright, so remember, the question that I asked was, is the egg going to sink when I put it in the water? So there's my question. My hypothesis? Yes, the egg is going to sink when I put it into this water. Now my experiment. Let's put the egg into the water and we'll see. Yep, that definitely sunk straight to the bottom of the water. Now I'm going to use the spoon to get this out of here. Alright, so what do we know from this? Well, step 4 is to observe what happened. It sunk to the bottom. It definitely did. So my conclusion is that my hypothesis was correct. The egg is going to sink to the bottom of the water. But you know, the scientific method is all about diving deeper into science, diving deeper and using your curiosity to understand more about science, to understand more about the world around you. So we're going to take this a step further. What happens if I put salt in the water? You think the egg will still sink? That's my question. Will the egg sink in salt water? My hypothesis is yes, it will sink in salt water. It sinks in this water, so why shouldn't it sink in salt water? So we're going to have it perform another experiment here. And then we're going to take this spoon and we're going to put 5 tablespoons of salt into our water, and we're going to mix it up. All right, there's 5. Now, stir up your salt water. Take a while to do this. We need to make sure all of the salt dissolves in the water. All right. So now we have our salt water here. You can tell it's nowhere near as clear. This is definitely salt water. So will the egg sink in the salt water? My hypothesis is yes, it will. It's sunk in the normal water, so it should sink in this water. So now let's run an experiment just to test it. Oh my goodness. The egg floats. It does not sink. Now, this shows us something incredible about the scientific method. I was wrong, and yet my hypothesis was wrong. And yet the scientific method has still helped us so much in understanding more about this water, more about the egg, and more about a thing called density, which I'll explain in just a second. All right, for that last experiment, my hypothesis was wrong. Based on my conclusion, I proved that the egg actually didn't sink in the salt water like I thought it was. But that is all right, because we progressed. We know something now that we didn't know before. And that's the whole point of the scientific method, is so we can understand the world that's around us, understand things about this world that we don't otherwise know. And for those of you who'd like to know, the reason that the egg actually floats in the salt water but sinks in the actual water has to do with something called density. So water is not necessarily very dense. And the egg is just ever so slightly more dense than the water. Now, what does density mean? It means the amount of molecules that are concentrated in the volume of what we're talking about. So the amount of molecules in the water in a ratio to the amount of water we have would be the density of the water. And since the egg has a slightly higher density than the water, it will sink. But when we made the salt water, we actually made the density of the water higher by adding the salt to it. So there were more molecules in the water, because when the water dissolves the salt, it pulls it apart and then all of it mixes together. So there's a lot more molecules even though there's not any more water. It's the same amount of water, but there are more molecules there. So we made the density of the water higher than the density of the egg. And in any liquid, if you have an object that has a density lower than the liquid, that object is going to float on top of it. So that's what happened in our experiment. And we used the scientific method to understand more about that. And if I wanted to, I could keep going and going and going, repeating it over and over again, making more hypotheses, going and researching more about density, going and researching more about eggs and how they interact with water, and I would really be able to figure out a lot. And that's exactly what scientists are doing today, right now, and they've been doing it for a long time. We figured out density long ago. But we're learning new things every day, new things about our brain, new things about plants, photosynthesis. All of these things have been discovered and are continuing to be discovered using the scientific method that I just showed you in this video. So go and take this knowledge out into the world, you scientists.